Hi, everybody.
Hi.
My name is Corey Frey. I'm the exhibitions manager here at the Delaplaine. Before we get started, I wanted to tell you about a couple of things. If you haven't had time to check out our exhibitions, all of our exhibitions just opened this past Saturday, and it's a whole building changeover. So all of our 5 gallery spaces have brand new work in them. So it's worth time. It's worth your time to spend some time walking around and checking out the work. You're sitting in our Contemporary Innovations exhibition right now with from artist McKay Otto. If you go through the door right over that way to my right, there's some paintings and pastel work from Luce Merlin. Through the doorway there, Noah McWilliams has some sculptural and video work. There's 2 great shows on our second floor. Photographer June Jarkey, and then Max Winkler has some prints up there. So all that's just to say, spend some time, check out the exhibitions that we have going on. The other thing is that we're about to gear up for fall classes. So if you're interested in classes, or if you know of anyone that's interested in classes, you can check out our website. You can grab one of our magazines. There's some right outside the gallery here. And up front at the front desk, you can grab a magazine. It'll tell you about all the programming, coming exhibitions, classes, everything that we have going on. So, every quarter we have an artist of inspiration here at the Delaplaine, and we try to look at the work of some prominent figure in art history. And have some programming, a little bit of programming designed around highlighting their career. Right outside the gallery door, there's also an art cart that is sort of centered around Jeanne-Claude and Christo's work. As well as on the second floor, there's some coloring sheets and some biography stuff up there as well. But we also try to gear one of our talks, at least in some way, connected to our artists of inspiration. And you know, Christo and Jeanne-Claude were such prominent figures in the art world that, you know, I reached out to a few people and no one took the bait, so I'm doing the talk today. No, I'm actually really excited to do the talk. And I've followed their work for a while, but I wanted to ask, first off, has anyone seen Christo and Jeanne-Claude's work in person? Yeah? What work did you see?
The gates in
Yeah?
Central Park.
Okay.
And I wanted to go to the Eiffel Tower
Yeah.
when it was wrapped, but didn't work out.
Yeah. What about y'all?
The gates.
Yeah? You as well? What about you folks? The gates? Okay.
Goodness.
Dave, what did you see?
Gates.
Yeah? Tim?
I was out in California and saw the umbrellas.
Oh, nice. Okay. Yeah. We'll be talking about the gates and the umbrellas a little bit, so. That's great. You all are probably more qualified than I am to talk about his work because I've never seen any in person, with the exception of I worked for AC Moore, the arts and crafts store. I managed their custom framing department for a while. And the reason why this is connected is that somebody brought in a piece of one of the gates that Christo and Jeanne-Claude, you know, they cut and sold with some of their other marketing material in order to fund future projects. So I got to shadow box a piece of the gates is my direct connection to them. But I've followed their work for a long time. I remember first coming across their work, I think in a book that I had from the MoMA. And at the time I was just getting into art history and I didn't really know what I was looking at. Didn't really understand. You know, probably none of us really understand to the full, but it was at least a little bit of an exposure that had my interest. I wanted to start off by talking about a quote that I've loved for a long time. You know, I'm not an expert. I'm not an art historian. I'm just an enthusiast and a practicing artist. And as a practicing artist, I'm really interested in this idea of concealing certain things in order to enhance them. And I came across this quote that has been attributed to several people, but I think the most prominent attribution for the quote is from Victor Hugo, who wrote Les Miserables and The Hunchback of Notre Dame. And he said, "There's nothing more interesting than a wall behind which something is happening." There's nothing more interesting than a wall behind which something is happening. I want us to hold on to that quote as we talk about Christo and Jeanne-Claude's work. Christo Yavichev was born in 1935 in Bulgaria. He began at the age of 6 to show talent for drawing, and he started taking painting lessons and drawing lessons. This is a picture of him taking lessons at the National Academy of Art in Sofia, Bulgaria, and this is Christo right here. At the age of 14, he was trained as a classical painter, and that becomes a really interesting point throughout his career. His exposure to art-making methods and art in general and ideas surrounding art was sort of limited to the National Academy, was limited at the National Academy due to strict policies under the communist doctrine of socialist realism. So here's a couple of examples of socialist realism. One's a little more contemporary than the other. But there were strict guidelines in Bulgaria and in communist countries as far as what was acceptable in a work of art. And there were, of course, propagandistic ties to some of those restrictions. And this is the life of art that Christo is brought up in. This is the world of art that he understands at the beginning. There's not a whole lot of paintings left of Christo's. This one just happens to be available to us because his brother held on to it. But this is a piece called Rest from 1954. And it shows thematically some of the ideas that were sort of acceptable in socialist realism painting, the hardworking agriculture workers. He was sort of chided by some of his art instructors for this piece because of the forlorn look on the faces of some of the workers. They were supposed to look a little more joyous about being out in the fields and working hard. There was also some negative remarks about the diagonal of the horizon line in the background, and the ways that could subliminally lead you to thinking of some sort of decline in the way that people thought about things at the time. So he's brought up underneath this pretty strict way of thinking about imagery. You know, the piece, of course, like I said, has its own idiosyncrasies as far as the work of other socialist realism, but there are a lot of similar elements that are present in it as well. But something really important happens to Christo in the fall of 1956. When he's 21 years old, he receives permission to travel, and he goes on a trip to Czechoslovakia. So while in Czechoslovakia, he goes to the city of Prague with a sketchbook and a pencil and some oils, and he's traveling around the city, drawing and painting, making sketches, filling up his notebooks, and he's also being exposed to some new art ideas, new for him, in some of the modern artwork that he's exposed to in Prague. He's exposed for the first time to works by Picasso and by Joan Miro, as well as lots of others. But One of the other things that happens while he's in Czechoslovakia is that in 1956, the Hungarian Revolution breaks out, and Christo decides not to return to his homeland. So with sort of this new exposure to a liberation of the constraints of what is possible in art making, Christo decides to stow away in a freight car, a sealed freight car, with several other people, bribing a railway employee and making his way to Vienna, Austria. One of the interesting things about researching Christo and Jeanne-Claude's life is there's, a lot of the backstory of them is sort of hearsay, and it becomes sort of the stuff of legends in some ways. Not a lot of the information is really corroborated, and there's some skepticism as far as how he even got to Vienna, Austria. But I think it's an interesting idea. This idea of the restrictions that were posed around him, and the ways that they felt like they needed to develop an identity that was sort of larger than life. And we'll talk a little bit more about that here in a little bit. But while he's in Vienna, he enrolls at the the Vienna Academy of Fine Arts in order to avoid being moved to refugee camps. And he eventually moves again to Paris in 1958. While he's in Vienna and in Paris, he's poor. He has very little money, and so he's doing work like washing cars and washing dishes. But the other thing that he's doing is he's painting classical portraits of the upper class, primarily women. And in 1958, he's commissioned to paint a portrait of Priscilla de Gilbon. I don't know French, so you're going to have to excuse my terrible pronunciations. And as he's working on this commission, he's introduced to her daughter, Jeanne-Claude. Again, sort of the stuff of legends. I'm sure that maybe this information can be corroborated, but it turns out that Christo and Jeanne-Claude were born on the exact same day, June the 13th, 1935. Jeanne-Claude was born to a French military family, so she moved around a lot. She was a student of Latin and philosophy. She'd received an education in Morocco, France, Switzerland, Tunisia. She had a very extroverted personality and great organizational skills. And as their romance sort of blossoms and they take an interest in one another's abilities in their own work, their professional life also, there's a bond surrounding their professional life that's really interesting. Jeanne-Claude's organizational skills allowed her to sort of be the structural element within the whimsy and spontaneity that sometimes creativity requires. So this structuring, Jeanne-Claude as an organizer and a fundraiser and an overseeing of projects and logistics, and Christo as a draftsman, a dreamer, an initiator of ideas, characterized their professional relationship, and I'm sure that it probably had some benefits in their marriage as well. I'm married to a very organized person, and I can have my head in the clouds quite a bit, and that benefits us. We complement one another in that way. So I wanted to mention something at this point, that in art making on their scale and with the sort of work that they were doing, it brings up a really interesting point about where art making ends and where something else begins. It's worth mentioning that the stride that this takes in the ways that we perceive art history today, and in some ways it really messes with the idea that's been simmering since the Renaissance of the sole artist as genius. There's no doubt that there can be questions that are asked of their career and roles in gender equality within the scope of understanding art history. And at least in one notable example, Jeanne-Claude was, kind of living in the shadow of Christo and not really being credited for things. It said that she wasn't credited for, until 1994, she wasn't credited for the role that she played in Christo's first solo exhibition in 1961. I want to get into a little bit of the question of how do you move from making work like this to making work like that, and then making work on the grand scale of something like the Gates or any of the other works that they're credited with. And this is tricky. I'm going to engage in some speculation, and it's partly for fun because I'm an art nerd and I like thinking about these sort of things. And where I'm sure that he had inklings himself about why he was motivated to transition in the ways that he did. He's on the record of saying, when asked why he wrapped things, "I don't know why I wrapped things." And so we're left with quite a bit of speculation about sort of the drive, the impetus behind creating works like this. But a lot has been said about them, and so there are speculations that people have thrown out over the years that it alludes to Christo's sort of nomadic lifestyle, the feeling of being displaced and moving around his whole life, that in some metaphorical way he's packaging his belongings. Others have said that wrapping things was a means of dematerializing objects in a consumerist society. There's probably truth to all of these things. But I want us to think about Christo's exposure to the art world prior to leaving Bulgaria and then being dropped into the middle of modernism and the avant-garde of the time. We can kind of take for granted the fact that we can see the progression of our history the way that we do when we're not living in societies where those ideas are constrained. In the summer of 1958, something really important happens to Christo, where he goes to the World's Fair in Brussels. He encounters work at the World's Fair and in other places of the American avant-garde, of abstract expressionist painters, and work like these: Jean de Buffet, Jackson Pollock, Lucio Fontana. He progresses. I think Lucio Fontana is probably one of the more prominent influences in the way that he's drawing attention completely away from the pictorial surface by slicing the canvas, right? He slices and draws attention to the objectness of the surface. And Christo starts making work like these. These are called surface d'impactage. This is a large series, so if you go on their website, you can see lots of work like this. But in this series, he's taking cues from Fontana and Dubuffet in retreating further from the pictorial space to calling more and more attention to the surface. And where he's not entirely wrapping things yet, he's not entirely wrapping the substrate or the canvas or the board, he's still working on the surface. He's still using liquid mediums like paint and lacquer in these works. And some of the others, he's adding objects. I think this one has rope in it as well. Some of the other pieces in this series have cans that are affixed to the surface by fabric. Maybe you can say that these works are a bit affected. They're a little unoriginal. They're too much like the work that he was being exposed to. But what I'd really like to get at is Christo's desire to still work within an understanding of aesthetic experience. So from the series Surface d'Impactage, taking the next step isn't so hard to conceive. Where before he's concealing just the surface of the two-dimensional plane, the two-dimensional plane that once held the illusions of landscapes and figures and then fields of color and paint sliding off of brushes with the drive of movement, Christo goes one step further to conceal not just illusions, not just works of paint, but now paintings themselves as objects, as well as anything else that the mind can conceive. Impressionism, post-impressionism, cubism, all the way through to pure abstraction gave us this way of thinking about perception that naturally progresses to the kind of perceptual awareness that the work of Christo brings. The Impressionists through the Cubists, in a way, they're taking on a scientific endeavor. They aren't just being driven by their feelings, but they're thinking about optics and the way that we see. So here you have Monet's studies about the way that things transition and change in light on the left. Realizations in the neurology of optics were understood by artists sometimes before neurologists. There's a really interesting book from 2007 called Proust Was a Neuroscientist, the writer Proust. It goes through with Cézanne and several other artists in different mediums and talks about the things that they were discovering through their work that were later corroborated by neuroscience and by scientists after the fact. Here's why I'm saying all this. Is that what we understand about optics and the way of seeing now can help us understand and grab a hold of what Christo is trying to do and the work that artists have always done. And that's to see better, to understand more clearly, and at least have our frames of references widened. Now, I'm not an art historian, and I'm certainly not a neuroscientist. So forgive me if I don't have all the facts straight. But there's something to be said about the fact that your visual acuity, what's in focus for you when you're looking, is about the size of your fingernail held at arm's length. And from that place, as it goes out on the edges all the way to your periphery, things blur. There's something to be said for the fact that 10% of what we take in through our eyes is processed by our brain. It's like around 10%. And this is because it would take far too long for our brain to process all the visual information that we take in. We wouldn't be able to react as quickly as we do. So the question is, if it's just 10%, what's the other 90% made of? And the really interesting thing here is that most of it is made up of memory and of presupposition. Memory and presupposition. You know, there's this quote by Degas that says, "Art is not what you see, but what helps others to see." Artists are involved in this process of helping us all to slow down and pay closer attention to the world and the things that are just passing us by. This is why Van Gogh painted the peasants and shoes and a vase full of flowers. This is why we love his work, is because in some ways it rings more true than even photorealistic versions of vases or peasants or shoes in some ways. Again, here's why I'm saying all this, is that Christo goes one step further and he eliminates the details of the thing by only hinting at the surface. So rather than illuminating the way that we see, like the Impressionists and the Post-Impressionists, he follows the through line from Cubism and abstract expressionism, and he ends up putting the onus, the responsibility of perception, on the memory. And in doing so, he enhances our capacity to comprehend a thing, whether it's a paint can or a rocking horse or chairs. It's no mistake that coinciding with these strides in art history, similar ideas are being built by philosophers, by Heidegger and by Edmund Husserl, as they're developing the line of philosophy called phenomenology, a way of processing and understanding not just through what we can rationalize through observation, but the way that we interact with phenomenon through our experience. Perhaps we're being shown by Christo the prominent role of our memory, the things of the past, and how they play such an important role in the present, in our current state. And by wrapping objects, what lies beneath the wrapping now is relegated to the substrates and surfaces on the canvas of the mind and of memory. So, enough art theory. Let's dive into some of the larger works by Christo and Jeanne-Claude. So, in 1961, Christo has his first solo exhibition, and coinciding with this exhibition is their first realization of a larger scale temporary outdoor project called Dockside Packages at Cologne Harbor. It's constructed from rolls of paper and oil barrels wrapped with tarp and rope. And being aware of some of his later work, it feels a little bit clumsy. It feels like he's reaching towards something but hasn't really finalized it yet. But I love how art history shows us sort of these steps in progression. During his exhibition in the same year at Gallery J in Paris, Christo showed for the first time a study for a future piece that he hoped would be realized. This study is called Project for a Wrapped Public Building. So all the pieces that follow, all the images that I have, and if you go on their website and look at other projects, ones that I don't cover, you'll recognize a beginning date and an end date, and usually a lot of time in between. And this is because the beginning date usually reflects some of the initial steps of the project, so something like a sketch like this. You can see that some of the larger projects, depending on some of the logistical work, took years and sometimes decades to come to fruition. So studies and sketches like these would become a really important piece in the puzzle in figuring out the logistics for future large-scale projects. One really important thing about their sketches is that drawings and studies and sketches were made for planning and preparation, and they would be sold in order to fund larger works. So as their aspirations grew, as they began to dream up pieces that would require years of planning, filing and waiting for permits, as well as dodging the disapproval of those keeping projects from coming into the light of day, funding the work themselves was one less obstacle to try to juggle the justification of work in the eyes of the powers that be and of their critics. So it became really important to them that the experience also of their large-scale works be a free experience to the public, be something that wasn't ticketed, something that people could just come and enjoy. I don't have time to get exhaustive about their works. I tried to just select a few pieces that showed maybe a range of the kind of work that they did. But I wanted to start with this piece, Valley Curtain. On On August the 10th, 1972, in Rifle, Colorado, between Grand Junction and Glenwood Springs at the Grand Hogback Mountain Range, this work was finally finished with over 200,000 square feet of woven nylon fabric that comprised of this piece, Valley Curtain. So this piece had, this goes back a little bit to the idea about where does art making end and something else begin, because, you know, there are lots of other people involved in these large-scale works. Christo and Jeanne-Claude had 3 other designers helping them out with this piece, 35 construction workers, 64 temporary helpers, including art school students and college students. From its initiation to its finalization, it took 28 months to complete. And where wrapped objects sort of did the job of trying to augment the everyday by concealing, pieces like Valley Curtain and other work that they did, they cause us to look and perceive and think about the negative aspect of something like a valley. And when I say negative, of course I mean the spatial negativity, the result in between things. This is a piece called Surrounded Islands. In Biscayne Bay in Greater Miami, Florida. So Surrounded Islands does a similar thing in that it reveals sort of the invisible quality that makes an island by highlighting its lack of connectivity to other land masses on all sides. This piece is one that's said to, its initial ideas were said to be attributed to Jeanne-Claude and not Christo, that Jeanne-Claude came up with the idea. It's composed of 6.5 million square feet of floating pink woven polypropylene fabric that covered the surface of the water and extended out 200 feet from each island in the bay. There were 11 islands that were a part of the project, and it was constructed from 79 different sewn patterns that surrounded the contours of each of the islands. Here's one of the sketches of this piece. The sketches are beautiful. Here's Tim's piece, The Umbrellas. Oops. So The Umbrellas was completed in 1991, and it was comprised of 1,760 yellow umbrellas that were erected in California, and 1,340 blue umbrellas that were erected in Japan. There were 11 manufacturers in Japan, the United States, Germany, Canada, that all prepared the elements of the umbrellas, the fabric, the aluminum superstructure, the steel frame bases, the anchors, the wooden supports, the molded base covers, the bags. And all 3,100 umbrellas were assembled in Bakersfield, California, where then the 1,340 were shipped from California to Japan. The project cost $26 million. It attracted over 3 million visitors, but it had to be closed early due to a tragic event where in California, one of the yellow umbrellas was actually the structure of the umbrella held intact, but the ground gave loose in a windstorm, and it actually pinned a woman against a rock and killed her. So they had to cut the project short. Christo was, said after the fact, traumatized by the experience, but thinking about logistics for the future, he talked about how they actually wind tunnel tested the umbrellas before they constructed them in winds of up to 65 miles per hour. And of course that that helped them realize that the structures would hold, but it didn't help them foresee problems with the ground where they were, affixed to the ground. I don't know why, but I think the wrapped Reichstag building is one of my favorite ones. I think it's all the intricacy of the building that still shows through all the wrapping. So this project took 24 years since the beginning of the conception of the idea to the fruition of the idea. Wrapped Reichstag was completed on June the 24th, 1995 by a workforce of 90 professional climbers, 120 installation workers, and it remained wrapped for 14 days. And this work, as well as a lot of others after the fact, once everything was taken down after the 14 days, they recycled all of the materials that were left, with the exception of the pieces of cloth that they sold. This piece has 1,076,390 square feet of thick woven polypropylene fabric and 9.7 miles of blue polypropylene rope that were used for wrapping the building. The facades and the towers and the roof were covered by 70 tailor-made fabric panels. The project was actually first proposed by Michael Cullen, who was a Berlin historian who knew of Christo's desire to wrap something in the city and also to wrap a government building. Michael Cullen, who proposed the idea, had written extensively about the Reichstag, and he suggested it to Christo because it wasn't being used except as an exhibition hall. He thought that it would be an ideal place for Christo to wrap a national capital. And they sort of jumped on the opportunity that after the reunification of Germany, the government decided to relocate its capital back to Berlin and utilize the building. And the opportunities for the project fulfillment presented itself because renovations had to be done to the building before they moved back in. Here's the gates. So in 2005, the gates was completed. This piece consisted of 7,503 vinyl gates along 23 miles of pathways in Central Park in New York City. The gates were 16 feet tall and varied in width from 5 feet 6 inches to 18 feet, according to the 25 different widths of walkways that the gate covered. The saffron-colored vinyl stopped 7 feet above the ground, and it was up for 16 days. The materials were also recycled, like I said before. And part of the inspiration for this, for the project, the gates, comes from Japanese torii gates traditionally constructed at the entrance to Shinto shrines. You can see the similarity there. There's a great documentary, by the way. I'm sure some of you have seen it, specifically about the gates. And it shows some of the things that they had to endure to finalize the project, some of the meetings that they sat through, just really vehement opposition to the idea, even though it was lasting for 14 days, people just adamantly against the place where they took their strolls being covered by these fabric gates.
Oh, I
Yes.
misspoke before. It wasn't the Eiffel Tower, it was the Arc de Triomphe.
Okay, yeah,
But wrapping the Eiffel Tower is a good idea.
it's a great idea.
Anyway,
You should do it.
I'll put in my application.
I'll help you. We'll come up with a
Get lot of
plan.
attention.
Yeah, we'll finish it in 2037. I don't know.
There you go.
before we get into the Arch de Triomphe, I wanted to talk about, before this project was finalized, November 18th, 2009, Jeanne-Claude actually passed away in New York. She'd had a brain aneurysm and died in the hospital. But her and Christo had made this pact with one another. It said that they flew in separate airplanes anywhere that they went, so that in case one of the airplanes went down, the other one could finalize some of the works in progress that they were in the middle of. In a similar promise, they had let one another know that if one of them had passed away, that they would finish the projects that they'd started. And so Christo, with Jeanne-Claude having passed away, worked with a team to complete some other projects and come up with ideas for new ones. There's projects like Over the River and the Mastaba, as well as this piece, L'Arc de Triomphe in Paris. So this was completed in September of 2001 and was done in partnership with the City of Paris and their Center for National Monuments. And it was on view for 16 days. In the middle of this project, Christo actually passed away. So he was 84 years old. But their team was actually able to finish the project. It was delayed for years and then further delayed by the coronavirus. But they finally completed it in September of 2001. I mentioned before that there was a considerable amount of controversy surrounding their work. Some of it just seems a little out of place and like people complaining for the sake of complaining. Some of it's legitimate. People were concerned about traffic congestion with work that was near roadways. There were public hearings about work being an eyesore. I know in the documentary about the gates, someone said, why would you cover up a work of art talking about Central Park with another work of art? So there were all kinds of opposition to their work. Whether or not you like their work, something has to be said about the drive of creativity. Even with their fame in the last years of their life, when you think about being penniless and pushing through towards new ideas that aren't necessarily understood and don't have a precedent, that idea of the creative spirit is something that's really inspiring for me. So whether or not you like their work, their perseverance, there's something to be said for their perseverance. When asked about their meaning of the work, Christo and Jeanne-Claude always pointed to a desire to open people's eyes to wonder and to beauty. The wonder and beauty that surrounds everyone on a daily basis, and where there were adversaries complaining about the work's lack of taste or a lack of traditional understandings of beauty, they likely weren't complaining about the beauty that Christo and Jeanne-Claude's work was meant to augment. That's all around us, in our everyday lives. The strange and curious objects of buildings and landscapes that we sometimes just don't pay attention to. So yeah, I don't know that I have any answers if you have any questions, but I'd love to even hear about some of your experience with the gates or any of the works that you encountered. Does anything stick out to you all that were able to see any of his work in person, or does anyone have any questions at all?
I bet you'll have an answer to this one. You used the word penniless, just your last remarks. Were they penniless at the end?
No.
Or just in the beginning?
Yeah, I meant at the beginning, when Christo moves from Bulgaria to Vienna, then to Paris.
Oh yeah.
He's washing dishes. He's doing these menial jobs that that end up being noble when you're taking care of yourself and taking care of your family and things. But I would imagine, the amount of energy and driving force and even coming up with materials. When you think about the objects that he was first wrapping, these are objects that are just around him all the time. He's, maybe finding fabric in order to wrap things that are just around him. And so that drive of creativity is for sure present there. But yeah, they certainly didn't die penniless at the end.
Okay, that would surprise me.
Yeah.
Corporate sponsors.
But off of that, I was thinking the same thing when you were talking about how would you profit off of something like that that's open to the public, there's no way of selling tickets. And it costs millions and millions, tens of millions of dollars to produce.
Well, if you look at some of their projects and you look at the amount of sketches, marketing material, especially once they grew to an international prominence, and you think about the prices that artworks sort of gather these days, and the amount of sketches and things that they're putting out into the world for sale, I would imagine it did a great deal. It bolstered the funding for projects, but I'm sure that it profited them individually as well.
But that would make sense, yeah.
Yeah.
Am I wrong about corporate sponsors? I'm Googling.
They didn't typically take any sort of sponsorship for their work. Yeah, all their large projects were personally funded.
All right, I
Yeah.
stand informed.
There was some controversy surrounding that as well, but
Our corporate sponsors. Anyway,
yeah.
it's too detailed to read out loud. Oh, you'll kill me.
Yes.
Do you have any idea where they picked the color for the gates?
I don't, and I had a feeling that question was going to come up. Other than the color of the Shinto shrines, the gates of the Shinto shrines
I
in
think
Japan.
there was a connection to the Buddhist monks in Thailand too. I remember having a scrap and reading about it.
Yeah.
Ancient scrap.
Yeah, you see the same color as far back as the Valley work as well. So it definitely has some sort of personal connection there. Other questions, thoughts, ideas?
One thing about the umbrellas, I'm having flashbacks from way back when.
Yeah.
Was we were there on the day when they had the problem, and my memory is that it was really short. It was like we all knew it was coming, and then finally the opening weekend, and I want to say it was either that first week or that weekend, and it closed almost instantly.
Yeah.
And we were there with the sun on the hills, and so everything was brightly lit. The gold of the California burnout with the umbrellas on them, and then the whole backdrop was black. It was just this huge storm that was coming. We could all see it coming, and then when we went to leave, we could see them taking down the umbrellas, which we thought was weird because in those days we didn't have phones or anything like that. And then it was that either on the way home or when we got home, we found out that they had closed it. But it was brilliant because of the storm. For me, it was. That's one thing I remember was the beauty of that black sky.
Yeah.
California storms.
There's something to be said too for their international prominence in that something so short-lived had 3 million visitors to it. Like that's crazy.
It was really busy when we were there. I mean, it went for miles, and so you could just see it from the freeway. You could see it. You get off on the side roads and everything. So it was really. I'd be interested to know how they came up with the number at all.
Yeah.
Just because you could see it forever.
Yeah. Any other questions?
Do you want a smidgen of the money issue?
Sure.
Google's, well, this is DuckDuckGo now. It says the gates cost $21 million in both the artists and the supporting institutions, the City of New York and Central Park Conservancy, were quick to emphasize that Christo and Jeanne-Claude financed the project themselves and that the installation was free to the public. So that's consistent with what you said. Shocking.
There was I can't remember what the newspaper was or what the organization was, but they went through and like an itemized list of all the materials for the gates and priced it out themselves, and there was some controversy around it not costing the $26 million that they said that it costed. So
There's always a spoiler.
Oh, sure. There's
No, they made that number up.
yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Oh gosh. Well, thank you all very much. Thank you very much for coming out and for your attention. Take some time to wander around the galleries. The other thing is, if you know somebody that's interested in the talk or any of the other talks that we've done and you missed them, we will, within some time, put them up on our YouTube channel. We've got a YouTube channel full of talks over the last 2.5 years or so. So there's lots of good stuff there. So thank you all very much.
Thank you.